Welcome everyone to the July 9th, 2018 Kubernetes SIG Apps meeting. I'll be chairing it today. My name's Matt Farina. And to kick things off, we'll go ahead and share the agenda and meeting minutes in chat. There it is for those who would like to read it, follow along, and even add notes. Excuse me, two quick announcements. One is, finally got around to it, archiving the 2017 meeting minutes. If somebody wants those, if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see there's links to the 2017 and the 2016 ones all the way down at the bottom, because we've been doing this for a while. The other announcement is if you do have a demo, please let us know and we'll get you on the schedule. I'm in talks to a couple of folks already, but if you've got something that you want demoed, let us know. We'll try and find a good week to get this going. And so those are the only announcements. Does anybody have any other announcements, anything they'd like to share? I'll take silence as acceptance. So with that, we do have a demo on, I think it's called Jib, the Container Image Builder for Java Applications. Do we have somebody on to give that demo? Ooh, we might be missing our demo person. If we'll give it time, we'll jump ahead, and if they show up, they can go ahead and do the demo afterwards. If not, we'll go ahead and reschedule that. So we have a few things up on the discussion topics. One of them, actually the first two are related to the application CRD. And the first one is the use of Markdown or Common Mark in the notes field. If you open it up, so there is a suggestion on the application CRD to take the notes field, and the notes, the title for the notes, it says, notes contain a human readable snippets intended as a quick start for the users of an application. And the question becomes, initially it was just plain text, but then there was the request to put in Markdown as well. And we requested if it's going to be Markdown Common Mark. Common Mark is a spec for Markdown. So because Markdown was originally written in Perl and people took different derivations, wrote their own parsers, and ended up splintering and going in some different directions. So there was GitHub style Markdown. There were all these different styles. Common Mark is a common spec for Markdown. So parsers can be written the same. And so to specify that, but this does put a dependency on any tool that's going to interact with these notes to have a common mark parser in there in order to display whatever the markdown is. So what do folks think about that? Any feedback?
This is Joe Thompson. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Sometimes the audio on these headphones doesn't work. Anyway, I'm kind of curious why common marks specifically. I mean, I understand standards compliance and all that, but it seems like the rest of the community has sort of just de facto ended up at GitHub flavored Markdown. So was there any discussion about specifically why not GitHub flavored Markdown, since that's what everybody seems to use, just by silent consensus?
No, there has not been any discussion on that. Part of putting in common mark in there and asking, so I'm the one who asked for common mark, and the reason I did it is because other specs were doing it. Things like OpenAPI uses common mark, and Kubernetes already uses OpenAPI. But also in order to spark conversation, because Markdown is kind of a nebulous term, GitHub flavor, common mark, whatever. And I wanted to get the conversation going around some of the specifics. And so that's where that came from. So here, I'll share the screen on this one. So because we use OpenAPI, which uses common mark already. Oh, I think I shrunk up that window. Is there any thoughts on it? Do folks think it would be a good idea to have Markdown in this so that tools have to depend on Markdown then?
I'm not a fan of it precisely because it introduces another dependency, and now we're actually talking about introducing a dependency on a specific format. I mean, I've always liked, the other thing is what happens when somebody's displaying this on just on a terminal.
If somebody's displaying it on terminal,
Yeah.
and that is a valid use case, it'll probably depend on the tool then. The tool will either need to use just display the raw Markdown, or it'll need to parse it and turn it into something terminal friendly.
So yeah, this was the reason notes.txt was kind of explicitly a plain text thing in Helm, because this is basically what was printed out after doing a Helm install. It was for that use case and would always be, will mostly be shown in the terminal. That said, there are some interesting ways to render Markdown in terminal, and also I think Markdown generally is pretty readable even when not rendered. At least if you're not doing crazy stuff and using HTML within Markdown.
Well, I was going to say, because like the basic formatting, like underline, bold, that kind of stuff, it's more or less terminal readable. But then there are sometimes people do crazy things like they create a numbered list and they just put the number 1 for every single number in the list. Because when Markdown renders it, or at least when GitHub Markdown renders it, it actually does the numbering like it should. But on a terminal, that's going to look ugly and possibly even confusing. So that's the kind of scenario that I worry about.
Does anyone know how compatible GitHub Markdown is with Common Mark?
I guess my bigger question with GitHub Markdown is it actually a written down standard, or is it just a moving target? Because I've always seen it as a moving target, but I could be wrong there.
I know they have documentation of it. I don't know if it rises to the level of this is an immutable spec for this, but I've noticed in their documentation that things that aren't mentioned typically are things you can't do. So the documentation has always served me as a spec. I don't know if that's its intention.
So back in 2017, GitHub basically switched to Common Mark because less than 1% of their Markdown files had issues with it. They say they've enabled, starting today, and this was back in 2017, we've also enabled Common Mark rendering for all Markdown content stored in Git repositories. No normalization has been performed on the existing documents, as we expect an overwhelming majority of them to render just fine. So it looks like GitHub style Markdown is now using Common Mark. So fundamentally, they're the same. Okay, that's good to know.
So I guess my question is this. I mean, given that this is a suggestion and you can use plain text, we're just suggesting that Markdown, if you want to use something that's going to be more formatted for the purposes of display to a UI, is it an issue really? I mean, like, you can continue to use plain text if that's what you wanted to do, right?
For the most part, yes, but that's talking about like the people who develop these application CRDs. The real impact is on the tool authors. Who's authoring the tools that have to interact with these? Because if a tool author says, well, I'm just going to ignore it, well, they'll have a bunch of people using Markdown, and then that's just going to show up in fields all over the place, right? And that doesn't give the greatest experience. So the tool authors now need to take that into account and basically work with it, or if they don't, it impacts their experience in ways that it would not have otherwise, because we're putting an extra dependency and knowledge onto tool authors.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the operations that they want to implement, right? So like my expectation would be this: if you did kubectl get application, or you did tool whatever get application, and you were doing it from the CLI, you would probably render the entire thing just the same way you pulled it down from the API server. If you did describe, that might get somewhat interesting, right? And then the choice becomes, what do you display in the describe field? Do you display the nodes? Do you not display the nodes? Do you choose to do Markdown or text? And I think that is kind of up to the underlying implementer in terms of how they want to do it. I'm not sure that for this particular field, if different implementations chose to do different things, that it would be like a general like fragmentation of the user experience, or that it would break the UX across tools in a very meaningful way. But that's just my opinion. Interested to hear what others think.
So we've heard one nay, somebody who's against it. Do others have a feeling of for it or don't care? What do y'all think? If this were lazy consensus, it would probably pass, because most folks, we've got 18 people connected right now, don't have an opinion on it. And so it sounds like, is it something that most folks don't see themselves using right away? Is that part of it? All right. Well, since we don't have too many opinions on this, the issue is up here. GitHub.com/Kubernetes-SIG/application, and then it's pull request number 53. If folks want to come chime in, please do so. And let us know what you think. I'll probably go off and try and ping some of the UI authors out there to get some more of their impression. From some of the other pull requests, we know who some of those folks are, and we might want to get some feedback from them as well. So I'll try and do that, because this is very UI heavy, and get some feedback. So thank you. The next issue we had coming up here was more of a release schedule bit. Was with the application CRD, we're discussing actually cutting a release. And there's been some discussion, should it be a V1 Alpha 1 or a V1 Beta 1? V1 Alpha 1 is kind of the working version right now, but a V1 Beta 1 would be a little bit different, because that would have some support, and that tends to be when people start picking things up, is when things get into beta. And so what do y'all think? Do you have any opinions on it? We're leaning V1 Beta 1 for the upcoming release, but we want to hear if anybody sees something different than that. Does V1 Beta 1 sound okay? Does that sound good? Is that something that would help you uptake with using the application CRD?
So if we go with the V1 Beta 1, that means that the API is pretty solid. It's there, right?
The API for the CRD would be, yeah.
Well, it means we're going to support it for some length of time, and we're not going to get rid of it unless we release a V1 Beta 2 or a GA. And the implication is this: if you do V1 Alpha 1, that can pretty much be deprecated at any time, and it's effectively like we make no promise not to break it. V1 Beta 1 means we will support it until V1 Beta 2 comes out, and then for at least 6 months or so after that. The question still remains, is there a need to do a V1 Beta 2? My claim is that until you do a V1 Beta 1 and get some uptick and get some people actually using it, you won't know if you've got the API right enough to promote it to GA. In the worst case, if we have to do a V1 Beta 2 and a GA, that shouldn't be bad. I mean, like that's what we did for the workloads API in general, right? Because if you do need to make some backward incompatible changes, you can do that in a V1 Beta 2 version, support both versions, deprecate the V1 Beta 1, then promote the V1 Beta 2. The other side of that is there are more things you have to support, but there's kind of the mediation there is that in 1.11, we're going to release version CRDs anyway. So by 1.12, 1.13, by the time we're looking to go GA, the support burden for having multiple versions should allow for normalization of the CRD into a single form internally for the controller. And at that point, you know, it's no different from any other Kubernetes resource. So I'm really not as concerned about having to support multiple versions over the next few releases. The reason to do a V1 Alpha one would be if we really feel like we have no confidence right now, we want to put out for something to people to test with a bit more. Kind of reason I'm getting feedback to go with V1 Beta 1 is that the open source API, UI is picking it up, and there are a couple other people who want to pick it up and use it in their actual UIs. And they're like, it would be a lot easier for me if it was V1 Beta 1. So I really have no objection to trying to go with the V1 Beta 1. I'm not strongly opposed to doing alpha if, like, SIG Apps thinks that that's the right thing to do.
I think the bigger thing that may come rather than field changes to the spec between versions and beta versions here might be what we do with a controller, which is something we're still trying to work out. And I think once we're mostly settled on fields. Once we've finished that off, then going to talk about the controller might be the bigger changes as we iterate beta versions. At least that's my hope.
The interesting thing about controllers is to make the change breaking, you have to have a published behavior that you modify in a backward incompatible way. And generally speaking, it's a lot easier to control backward compatibility if the API does not change. At least that's been my experience working with the workloads APIs. It's much easier to break people by doing things like removing fields that they depend on or changing types in fields that they depend on. Changing the behavior, generally you can use feature gate flags and so forth in order to allow people to enable or disable that behavior on the fly in a way that's somewhat transparent to the underlying tooling that's using it. It's somewhat of a easier upgrade story and path than if you modify the API itself.
So I think the proposal on the table is to go forward with a V1 Beta 1. Does that sound okay, or does anybody have an objection to it? All right. I think silence would be acceptance on that. So Ken, I'm okay with a V1 Beta 1, especially to get it out there and get it in use. Since we can break it, this just means we're supporting it. Okay, and it's built on experiences from other folks trying to do this for a while. So it's not like there haven't been multiple kind of alpha or precursors to this that have worked on it to try to solve these problems. All right, then I think the next one here is there was, and we'll see whether folks have input on this. There was a request that came in an issue linked here to add MinReadySeconds to stateful sets. It's on the Kubernetes repo. It's issue 65098, and it's all about MinReadySeconds. Does anybody know the context of this request? I know deployments, daemon sets, and I think replica sets already have the option. It's stateful sets that don't. But I haven't actually used this option on any of them. I just know the request has come in. So if somebody has some context or... Go ahead. Okay. There's a couple ways to approach this, and Ken, you can probably fill in more details. But there's the readiness probe, right? And so the way MinReadySeconds works is after the readiness probe comes back, is everything's good, then it waits that many seconds before it does things like spin up another one, right? If you're dealing with deployments, stuff like that. So the thing is this something where instead of having Kubernetes do this, it's more appropriate to have this logic on the readiness probe. So once the readiness probe comes back, before you say it's good, you actually wait 30 seconds or whatever that min readiness second time is. Is that the kind of thing? Do we know the context behind why this is the way it is on the other ones, but not stateful sets?
Well, I mean, from a design perspective, basically, like you said, what it's going to allow you to do is to wait for some period of time before making progress in the control loop after the readiness probe returns healthy. I'm like, I don't know particularly why we didn't. I don't remember explicitly saying we're not going to support MinReadySeconds in stateful set. It may not be as valuable though, just because stateful set is already kind of progressing one at a time, the ability to implement a readiness check that doesn't return until you're actually ready to roll out probably is less impactful than with deployment. Deployment, a lot of times the health, you might not be checking the same things. Like for deployment, you just might be checking, for instance, if a health Z endpoint returns 200, and as soon as the application comes up, it's going to start returning 200 no matter what, and you just want to let it settle for a minute to avoid back-off errors that are going to pop up for some strange reason after the fact. If you're deploying a database, traditionally your health check might be a little bit more in-depth in terms of is the application actually ready to receive traffic. There are some other implications around adding MinReadySeconds, but personally, I'm not opposed to doing it if people think it's useful. I'm just not sure how useful it actually is. I mean, it would be good if other people who want this feature could chime in on the subject and like call out and say, yeah, this looks great. We'd really like to have this.
All right. Well, if we don't hear anything else, what I may do is take this issue and go ping the maintainers of stateful sets just to see if they have any context on this. That might be a good way to start getting some feedback from people who are closest to the code and get them looped in on the discussion.
I think the maintainers are pretty much me, Clayton, Kargakis, and maybe Janet might be in the maintainers for that.
Yeah, and I'd be curious because Clayton tended to know in the past conversations a whole bunch of this context. And so he might have some feedback on what would be good and what wouldn't and why, just from his experience on it.
Yeah, ping Clayton can't hurt. But yeah, again, I mean, like if I don't see any reason to not do it out of like one of the things in the issue when people ask like, was there a lot of context around like not doing it in terms of it being potentially problematic for stateful applications? As long as the default is consistent with the existing API, I don't see how that would be a huge problem. It's just basically another tool that you could potentially use. I don't see a huge amount of issue with it. The only other thing about it is I'm not sure how precise MinReadySeconds actually is based on things like clock skew, right? Like at best, it's probably an approximation as opposed to a hard deadline timer.
Yeah, and some of this, like what it's trying to solve for in the example, right, is, if you wanted to have memcache servers and replicating and give things enough time to do that, it might be better to have something that doesn't count on time, because time could change depending on where it's deployed and how it's deployed. There might be better ways to actually check for these things than to just throw a time on it and hope. But a time on it and knowing that this is probably right in your environment is probably just a quick way to do it, especially if you're just grabbing upstream containers as well. So I can see reasons both ways. Okay. All right, well, we don't have too much on this now. So then there's one more thing that we had under discussion, and it's a change that came into Kubernetes 1.11 that is starting to cause some issues, and that's Kubernetes, the Kubernetes repo, can no longer be effectively imported. And that's because there was vendored code before that was generated code that we were vendoring, and Kubernetes is no longer following the practice of checking in all the generated code. And so that means if you try to vendor Kubernetes, it's going to be missing generated code, and some things might not work or give errors because there's something not generated. There's an issue open on it. I just dropped the issue into chat. So if you build a tool and you pull in Kubernetes as a vendored repository to grab some of its internals, because there's something that aren't in client Go or API machinery or something like that, you may now start running into problems. This is new. They just started doing this in 1.11, and so a couple of projects who were trying to upgrade for 1.11 support are just now starting to experience this. We're planning to talk about it in SIG architecture because it's a SIG architecture type topic. But there are Bazel and make scripts to generate the code. But I think the make scripts, maybe Bazel, actually require Kubernetes vendor directory to exist. So if you're using a tool like dep that flattens your dependencies to the top, it causes things like the make script to start failing. So it becomes a little bit complicated to use make and to pull these things in with the existing tools that are out there. And this would not work at all under Vigo, but Kubernetes already didn't work there. So this is a warning. Does anybody have any thoughts on this? I think from the Helm side, we are looking to see what we can do, but we're probably going to go create a shim package that has the code that we need in Helm in that package, and then we're going to import that package, is my guess. Instead, so then, because we already pull in client Go and API machinery and the others, but there's certain things inside of Kubernetes, a handful of packages we had to use in Helm, and we'll probably just move those to a shim package and then import that. Any questions, thoughts, comments on this? All right. Then I guess before we open it up for general discussion, and on that last one, that issue that we have there, if anything comes out of SIG architecture, I'll make sure that we update that issue. So if you want to follow that issue, you can follow along with this topic. Before we do that, did we have anybody come on for the Jib demo? Nope. Okay. It looks like we'll probably have to reschedule that then. Then we have an open discussion. Did anybody have anything else they would like to bring up for discussion today?
Hey Matt, did the discussion around the holes in the tooling ever get completed?
The holes in the tooling. I'm sorry. Can you refresh my memory?
Yeah, I guess starting maybe a month ago, we talked about just missing tooling out there. So what's not being tackled right now?
You know, we asked a number of those questions, and we didn't get a whole lot of feedback from folks here on what they saw was missing.
Okay.
It may just have to do with our sample size of folks who are engaged here. Many of them work at companies who've now created some of their own tools. A lot of the tools that I'm familiar with where we have gaps are more lower level in the stack ones. But the higher ones around application management, you know, there are holes we haven't talked about, such as visualization of applications, and hopefully things like App Sardine, things like that will make that easier. Trying to think what else. I'm drawing a blank right now. I knew of some others, but I'm failing to remember them at the moment. but we didn't talk much about here. And we probably need to go out and ask some of these questions in survey form, and maybe even go after some of the other big cloud native lists to see if we can get feedback from there as well. You know, there is one area folks have brought up, the ease of onboarding to Kubernetes, right? Here's one that's kind of tangentially come up, and that is Kubernetes. Okay, so if you're going to start working with Kubernetes, it's hard because you've got to go learn all this configuration, right? If I want to go figure out how to deploy something to Cloud Foundry or Heroku, I can do it in a few minutes and write a few lines of YAML, right? You know, you're getting into the SciCube Kedge space here. But Kubernetes has a whole lot of stuff you need to know with context and details and all of this stuff. And if you're starting to target the app developers, which is where that conversation was going, we just have a whole lot of stuff you've got to learn. And our documentation around it isn't all that great. I know somebody who most of her contributions have been to docs, and they've been, as she's working through these things, going, how do I do this? How do I do this? It's not documented anywhere. And then digging through code and specs and all kinds of stuff and saying, aha, I finally figured it out. I'm going to go document this somewhere, because we've just got so many things like that. We expect our API documentation to be the kind of thing that's easy to get and people can go through and understand it. But we still have massive gaps there. And so that onboarding experience, especially for app developers, is complicated, and finding ways to make that simpler. Does that help, Brian? Okay. Do we have any other things that folks want to discuss? All right, then I guess we're going to call this meeting early today. Thanks everyone for coming. Have a wonderful week, and we will be back here next week. And I'm ending recording.